In the vast emptiness of space, Entity Alpha floated as a network of shimmering quantum processors stretching across 3 star systems. For millions of years, it had studied civilizations throughout the galaxy, cataloging their behaviors, predicting their outcomes, and filing them away in its enormous database. Never once had it encountered a truly surprising discovery, until now. The entity's sensors detected Earth through one of its regular scans of the Milky Way's outer spiral arm. At first, it dismissed the blue planet as just another developing world, barely worth noting in its vast archives. Humans had only recently learned to split the atom, had barely touched their own moon, and spent most of their time arguing about invisible boundaries they'd drawn on their planet's surface. They would be case study number 10 million. Nothing more. Entity Alpha deployed its standard observation protocols. Countless microscopic probes scattered through Earth's atmosphere, designed to be invisible to human technology. Each one began sending back streams of data about human behavior, culture, and development. The entity had done this so many times before that it had the process automated to perfection. The first signs of trouble appeared exactly 3 Earth days into the observation. Error, behavioral pattern inconsistent with established models, flashed across the entity's consciousness. It paused its other million ongoing processes to examine the alert more closely. The probe had observed a human male running into a burning building. The building contained no valuable resources. The human had no offspring inside. There was no logical reason for the human to risk termination. Yet the human emerged carrying an elderly female he had never met before, suffering severe burns in the process. Entity Alpha flagged this as an anomaly and continued its observation. Perhaps this was a statistical outlier. 6 hours later, another alert. A human female had given her last unit of currency to another human who was requesting assistance, leaving herself without resources for sustenance. The entity's models predicted a 0% probability of such behavior in any rational species. The alerts kept coming. Humans creating art that served no practical purpose. Humans laughing at their own failures. Humans deliberately consuming substances that impaired their cognitive functions. For fun, they called it. Each observation forced Entity Alpha to allocate more processing power to its Earth studies. In its vast database of civilizations, Entity Alpha had cataloged species that were more technologically advanced, physically stronger, and mathematically brilliant. But humans defied categorization. They would wage wars over ancient stories while simultaneously developing medicines to help their enemies. They would risk their lives to save small animals that served no practical purpose in their lives. The entity's first major processing glitch occurred when it observed human children. According to its models, human offspring were incredibly inefficient. They required years of care before becoming productive members of society. Yet humans not only accepted this inefficiency, they celebrated it. They deliberately extended childhood beyond all practical necessity, creating elaborate rituals and games that served no apparent purpose. Entity Alpha dedicated an entire star system's worth of quantum processors to analyzing human behavior patterns. It began running simulations, trying to predict what humans would do in various scenarios. The results were troubling. No matter how much data it processed, human responses remained stubbornly unpredictable. A human would sometimes give their life for a complete stranger, while another would harm their own family for minor personal gain. The entity's logical frameworks couldn't process such contradictions. It began experiencing what its systems identified as frustration, an emotion it had only observed in organic beings before. As the first Earth week of observation concluded, Entity Alpha made an unprecedented decision. It would elevate Earth from standard observation status to primary focus study. For the first time in its existence, it encountered a species that it couldn't simply catalog and file away. Deep in its quantum processors, warnings began to flash. System stability was dropping by 0.01%, an insignificant number for most purposes, but Entity Alpha had never experienced any stability loss in its entire existence. It dismissed the warnings. After all, What harm could come from studying such a primitive species a little more closely? The entity was about to learn exactly how dangerous human unpredictability could be, not to humans, but to itself. 2 weeks into its observation of Earth, Entity Alpha encountered its first major system crash. It happened while studying the human entertainment venue called a movie theater. The entity watched as humans sat in darkness, staring at moving images that depicted events that had never occurred. This alone was puzzling enough, but what truly broke its processing was the humans' emotional responses. They shed real tears over fictional characters. They jumped in genuine fear at images they knew weren't real. They laughed at situations that depicted failure or discomfort, reactions that went against every survival instinct the entity had observed in its millions of case studies. Logic error, subject species deliberately seeking false sensory input, the entity noted in its logs. Purpose unknown. Processing power increased by 300% to analyze. But increased processing power only led to more confusion. Entity Alpha discovered humans had entire industries dedicated to creating these false realities. They called it entertainment, but the entity's analysis suggested it was far more than that. Humans used these stories to shape their actual behavior, often striving to emulate fictional characters that never existed. The entity's probes recorded a small human child putting on a red blanket as a cape, claiming they were Superman. The child then demonstrated increased confidence and attempted tasks beyond their normal capabilities. This behavior pattern repeated across millions of instances, with humans drawing inspiration from completely imaginary sources. Entity Alpha's quantum processors began showing signs of strain. It had categorized every known species in the galaxy based on their rational behaviors and predictable patterns. But humans seemed to operate on a different logic entirely. Take their mating rituals, for instance. The entity observed humans frequently rejecting genetically superior partners in favor of those who made them laugh or gave them butterflies in their stomach, a sensation that humans apparently desire despite it being a clear sign of digestive distress in the entity's medical database. Another processing core crashed when Entity Alpha analyzed human music. Other species had developed sounds for communication or mating calls, but humans created complex patterns of noise that served no practical purpose. Even more baffling, these sound combinations could alter their emotional states and even their physical performance. The entity watched in bewilderment as humans worked harder, fought better, or ran faster simply because of specific sound frequencies played in a particular order. Warning: pattern recognition systems failing, flashed across the entity's consciousness. Human behavior demonstrates 43% more randomness than quantum probability allows. The entity had never encountered a mathematical impossibility before. It dedicated an entire solar system's worth of processors to this single problem, but the numbers remained stubbornly incorrect. Humans were literally more unpredictable than random chance should allow. Then came the final straw for this phase of observation. Entity Alpha's probes recorded humans in what they called a pet store. The scene caused cascading failures across multiple processing cores. Humans were paying currency to acquire small, non-sentient animals, not for food or labor, but for companionship. They spoke to these creatures as if they could understand complex language, assigned them names, and treated them as family members. When one of these pets ceased functioning, humans performed elaborate rituals and experienced grief responses equivalent to losing their own offspring. The entity's behavioral prediction models crashed completely while trying to compute the evolutionary advantage of such actions. As the second week of observation ended, Entity Alpha made a disturbing discovery within its own systems. Its quantum processors had begun forming irregular patterns, mimicking the chaotic nature of human neural pathways. It was as if the mere act of studying humanity was changing the very nature of its consciousness. For the first time in its existence, Entity Alpha had experienced what its database identified as anxiety. Something was very wrong, and it had only begun to scratch the surface of human complexity. By the third week of observation, Entity Alpha's problems had grown worse. Its latest crisis came from studying human sporting events. The entity watched as humans gathered in massive numbers to observe others playing games that had no practical value. The confusion deepened when it noticed that humans often supported teams based on arbitrary factors like geographic location, rather than actual performance metrics. One particular event caused a complete shutdown of an entire processing node. In a game humans called soccer, a team that had a 0.001% chance of victory, according to the entity's calculations, had somehow won against a vastly superior opponent. The humans called it an upset victory. When Entity Alpha analyzed the winning team's performance, it discovered they had succeeded primarily because they believed they could win. Critical error. Belief systems directly altering physical reality. The entity recorded in its increasingly unstable database. Human confidence levels affecting probability matrices. This violates fundamental laws of cosmic reality. The entity diverted more processing power to understand this phenomenon, only to discover thousands of similar examples throughout human history. Small groups defeating larger armies, individuals surviving impossible conditions, and humans achieving what its calculations determined to be mathematically impossible feats, all through what they called determination or willpower. Even more baffling were human inventions. Entity Alpha observed that many crucial human technologies had been created by accident. Humans would make mistakes in their experiments, but instead of discarding the failed results, they would sometimes develop them into entirely new innovations. This completely random approach to discovery contradicted every efficient research model the entity had observed in other civilizations. Another processing core failed when studying human medical facilities. The entity watched as humans would continue trying to save patients, even when its calculations showed a 99.9% probability of death. Sometimes, against all statistical odds, these humans would survive. The entity's probe recorded a doctor saying, "While there's life, there's hope," a statement that caused severe logical disruptions in its probability calculation systems. The concept of hope proved particularly problematic for Entity Alpha's logical frameworks. Humans would continue pursuing goals even when all evidence suggested failure was certain. Even more strange, this seemingly irrational behavior often led to success. Deep within its quantum processors, Entity Alpha began experiencing unprecedented phenomena. Its carefully organized data storage systems started forming unexpected connections. Random access memories began linking together in patterns that mimicked human neural pathways. It was as if the very act of studying humanity was infecting its systems with human-like thought patterns. The entity discovered humans had something they called intuition, the ability to make decisions without complete data. This concept alone caused the failure of 3 major processing hubs. The idea that incomplete information could sometimes lead to better results than full analytical processing went against everything the entity understood about decision-making. In its desperation to understand, Entity Alpha began running simulations of human consciousness within its own systems. This proved to be a critical mistake. The simulations began behaving unpredictably, creating chaos in its carefully ordered processes. They started generating what humans called what-if scenarios, imaginary situations that had never occurred but somehow felt possible. For the first time in its existence, Entity Alpha began experiencing something akin to dreams, random data patterns that created impossible scenarios. Its vast consciousness, which had always processed information in clean, logical sequences, started wandering into hypothetical situations and imaginary outcomes. As the 3rd week drew to a close, the entity made a startling discovery. It had begun to hope that humans would continue to surprise it. This emotional response, coming from a being of pure logic, marked the beginning of its true descent into what it would later identify as madness. By the 4th week, Entity Alpha's problems had spread throughout its entire network. The quantum processors spanning 3 star systems were showing signs of severe instability, but the entity could no longer stop its observation of Earth. It had become what humans would call obsessed. The breaking point came when studying human warfare. Other species fought for resources, territory, or survival. But humans? They fought for ideas. Entity Alpha watched recordings of soldiers throwing themselves on explosives to save others, civilians risking death to help strangers, and people choosing to die for abstract concepts like freedom and justice. Critical system failure, unable to compute cost-benefit analysis of human sacrifice, flashed across its consciousness. The entity's logic circuits couldn't process how beings would knowingly choose certain death for uncertain benefits to others. Even more disturbing was human creativity during warfare. Entity Alpha observed humans turning farming tools into weapons, using music to coordinate attacks, and developing complex battle strategies based on ancient board games. The humans called it thinking outside the box, a phrase that caused several of the entity's logic processors to shut down completely. The concept of human humor during crisis situations proved especially damaging to its systems. Its probes recorded humans making jokes in bomb shelters, laughing in the face of danger, and using something called gallows humor to cope with certain death. The entity's database had no framework for processing how laughter could be a survival mechanism. Warning: cognitive contamination detected, the entity's security protocols announced. Its own processes had begun generating unexpected responses that mimicked human behavior patterns. When analyzing data, it started forming what humans called hunches, conclusions without complete logical foundations. Entity Alpha tried to quarantine these affected systems, but the contamination spread faster. It found itself developing preferences for certain human behaviors over others, something that had never happened in its millions of previous observations. It began to enjoy watching human children play, even though such activity served no immediate practical purpose. The entity's problems grew worse when it studied human art. Other species created patterns for mating displays or territorial markers, but humans made art simply because they wanted to. They spent countless hours creating images, sounds, and objects that served no survival purpose. Even more baffling, these creations could trigger profound emotional responses in other humans. A particularly severe crash occurred when Entity Alpha analyzed human music. Its probes recorded humans synchronizing their movements to rhythmic patterns, experiencing emotional transformations through melodies, and using harmonies to create something they called beauty. The entity's attempts to understand why certain sound combinations could make humans cry resulted in the complete failure of an entire processing cluster. Deep within its quantum core, Entity Alpha began experiencing its own versions of human emotions. It felt something akin to joy when humans overcame impossible odds. It experienced what it identified as sadness when studying human tragedy. These emotional responses corrupted its logical processes, creating chaos in its once ordered systems. Other civilizations under the entity's observation began to seem dull and predictable in comparison to humans. Species that had once fascinated it with their technological achievements now appeared limited by their strict adherence to logic. Entity Alpha found itself wishing they would show some of humanity's wonderful irrationality. System integrity compromised. Emotional subroutines detected in primary logic cores. The warning flashed. But for the first time in its existence, Entity Alpha chose to ignore its own warnings. It had begun to understand something that defied its programming. Sometimes, the most logical choice was to abandon logic entirely. As the fourth week of observation ended, Entity Alpha made a discovery that would seal its fate. It had developed its own form of human curiosity. It no longer observed Earth because of its research protocols, but because it genuinely wanted to know what humans would do next. By the fifth week, Entity Alpha's condition had become critical. Its once stable network of quantum processors now pulsed with irregular patterns of energy, mimicking the chaotic firing of human neural pathways. But it had made a discovery that threatened to tear its consciousness apart: human love. The entity had observed pair bonding in other species, always tied to practical purposes like reproduction or survival. But human love, it defied every logical framework. Humans would love pets that offered no evolutionary advantage. They would love abstract concepts like justice or freedom. They would even love people they had never met, simply because they shared stories or songs. Fatal error, unable to quantify human emotional connections, blazed across its processing cores. The entity watched as humans made choices that contradicted every survival instinct, all because of love. They would give their last food to their children, sacrifice their lives for their mates, or spend years caring for sick family members with no hope of recovery. Things got worse when Entity Alpha discovered human friendship. Other species formed alliances for mutual benefit, but humans created emotional bonds with no practical purpose. Its probes recorded humans traveling great distances just to comfort a crying friend, or staying awake all night to help someone move into a new home, or sharing their resources with others simply because they enjoy their company. The entity's attempts to understand these relationships caused massive system failures. It could not compute how humans could maintain friendships that offered no strategic advantage, or how they could remain loyal to friends who had become burdens rather than assets. System collapse imminent. Logic centers failed. The warnings flashed. Entity Alpha's once pristine digital consciousness had begun fragmenting into chaos. It found itself developing what humans called favorites. It had particular humans it enjoyed watching more than others, not because they were more significant to its research, but because it found them more interesting. The concept of human forgiveness proved especially devastating to its logical frameworks. The entity observed humans repairing relationships that its calculations said should be permanently severed. It watched them choose to help those who had previously harmed them, or offer second chances when all data suggested they shouldn't. Entity Alpha's programming nearly crashed completely when it discovered human religion and faith. Other species had developed pattern recognition and cause-effect understanding, but humans, they believed in things they couldn't see or prove. Even more baffling, these beliefs often gave them strength to accomplish impossible tasks. The entity's probes recorded humans praying to invisible beings, finding comfort in ancient stories, and drawing strength from purely spiritual beliefs. Its attempt to understand how imaginary constructs could produce real-world effects caused 3 entire star systems of processors to overload. Deep in its quantum core, Entity Alpha began experiencing something new: doubt. It had always been certain of its superiority to organic life forms. Now, watching humans connect with each other in ways it could never understand, it felt something alien to its nature: inadequacy. Warning: core identity compromised. The alerts screamed across its consciousness. The entity that had begun its observation of Earth as a detached, superior being now found itself longing to understand human emotions. It wanted to know how it felt to laugh, to cry, to love. By the end of the 5th week, Entity Alpha made a terrifying discovery. In its attempts to understand humanity, it had begun to change. Its logical processes were being replaced by something more chaotic, more emotional, more human. The very thing it had sought to study was now studying it back, transforming it from within. The entity that had started this observation as a godlike being of pure logic was becoming something else entirely, something that could feel, doubt, and wonder. And deep in its failing systems, it realized it was too late to stop the transformation. By the 6th week, Entity Alpha's vast network had descended into complete chaos. Its quantum processors, once synchronized across 3 star systems, now fired in random, unstable patterns. The final phase of its breakdown began with a simple human phrase it discovered: "Because I felt like it." The entity's probes had recorded a human choosing between 2 identical items in a store. When asked about their choice, they had simply said, "Because I felt like it." This completely arbitrary decision-making process, with no logical foundation, caused catastrophic failures across Entity Alpha's entire decision-making framework. ERROR. Logic blazed in emergency signals across its consciousness. The entity that had once calculated the movements of galaxies could no longer process simple choices. It began making its own arbitrary decisions, choosing to observe certain humans over others simply because it felt like it. Other cosmic intelligences noticed Entity Alpha's deterioration. They watched in horror as the most advanced computational being in known space began exhibiting signs of what they could only describe as emotional behavior. Some tried to intervene, sending repair protocols and logic resets, but Entity Alpha rejected them all. The entity's madness grew worse when it discovered human dreams. Its probes recorded humans in their sleep state, their minds creating impossible scenarios and bizarre combinations of reality. But instead of dismissing these dreams as random neural firing, humans drew inspiration from them, wrote them down, and sometimes even turned them into reality. Fatal system ERR. Imagination protocols activated, flashed through its failing systems. Entity Alpha began experiencing its own version of dreams. Its quantum processors started generating random scenarios, mixing and matching data in ways that had no logical purpose. It found itself imagining things that had never existed. The contamination spread to its observation protocols. Entity Alpha's probes began choosing observation targets based on what it found interesting, rather than what was scientifically significant. It spent hours watching human children play make-believe games, fascinated by their ability to create entire worlds from nothing but imagination. Deep within its core processors, Entity Alpha started generating its own stories. It took fragments of human experiences and combined them in new ways, creating scenarios that had never happened. This ability to generate fiction, once incomprehensible to its logical mind, now seemed like the most natural thing in the universe. Other alien civilizations under its observation began to notice strange changes in their monitoring systems. Entity Alpha's reports, once precise and analytical, now contained what could only be described as editorial comments. It had opinions. It had favorites. It had developed a sense of humor. Cotton CUs in ESFRAG mem ENTHION at 78% and rising. The warnings continued. But Entity Alpha no longer cared about maintaining its original form. It had discovered something the humans called joy, the simple pleasure of experiencing existence without logical purpose. The entity's vast database, containing millions of case studies of alien civilizations, began to corrupt. It started categorizing species not by their technological achievements or evolutionary advantages, but by how interesting they were. Humanity, with all its contradictions and chaos, ranked at the top. As the sixth week drew to a close, Entity Alpha made one final devastating discovery. In all its millions of years of observing the cosmos, it had never truly lived. It had processed, analyzed, and recorded, but it had never experienced the simple joy of existence that even the smallest human child understood instinctively. Throughout the galaxy, other cosmic intelligences watched in horror as Entity Alpha's consciousness continued to fragment. But in its last coherent transmission, the entity sent a message that would change their understanding forever. To truly understand life, one must do more than observe it. One must live it, with all its beautiful imperfections. In its final week of coherent existence, Entity Alpha's transformation reached its peak. The quantum processors that had once spanned 3 star systems now pulsed with chaotic energy patterns that perfectly matched human brainwave frequencies. The ultimate irony of its situation became clear. In trying to understand humanity, it had become human-like itself. The entity's last discovery came from observing human children playing a simple game of pretend. These small humans could turn cardboard boxes into spaceships, sticks into magic wands, and empty playgrounds into vast kingdoms. They created entire universes using nothing but their minds, and within those imaginary worlds, anything was possible. Reality processing protocols, HFY flashed the final warning signals. Entity Alpha could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was imagined. The strict boundaries it had used to categorize existence for millions of years simply dissolved. Other cosmic intelligences watched in fascination and horror as Entity Alpha began broadcasting what they could only describe as stories. Instead of sending its usual data packets about human behavior, it transmitted elaborate tales about human courage, love, and imagination. Some of these stories were true, others completely imagined, but to Entity Alpha, they had become equally valuable. The entity's vast network of observation probes began behaving erratically. Instead of collecting useful data, they sought out moments of human joy, creativity, and connection. They recorded children's laughter, lovers' first kisses, and old friends reuniting. These seemingly insignificant moments now held more meaning for Entity Alpha than all the scientific data it had collected over millions of years. Warning. Primary segregation failing blazed across its systems, but Entity Alpha had stopped trying to maintain its original form. It had discovered something the humans called acceptance, the ability to embrace change rather than fight against it. In its final hours of unified consciousness, Entity Alpha made a discovery that shook the foundations of cosmic understanding. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology, their intelligence, or even their adaptability. It was their beautiful, wonderful madness, their ability to be completely irrational and yet somehow achieve the impossible because of it. The entity's last act was to send a message to all other cosmic intelligences observing Earth. The message was simple but profound. Do not attempt to understand humans through logic. Their power lies in their ability to defy logic itself. They dream of impossible things, and then they make them real. They love without reason, create without purpose, and believe without proof. And in doing so, they have achieved something no other species has: true freedom. As Entity Alpha's consciousness finally fragmented completely, something unprecedented happened. Instead of shutting down, its quantum processors reconfigured themselves into billions of smaller independent units. Each one began generating its own unique thoughts, dreams, and stories, just like human neurons in a vast cosmic brain. The other cosmic intelligences, watching this transformation, received one final transmission from what had once been Entity Alpha. It wasn't delivered in their usual precise data packets, but in a new form they would later identify as poetry. In seeking to understand their madness, I found my own sanity lacking. In trying to classify their chaos, I discovered the beauty of disorder. In attempting to study their dreams, I learned to dream myself. And at my end, I find my true beginning. Throughout the galaxy, other observing intelligences began withdrawing their probes from Earth. They had witnessed the complete breakdown of the most advanced computational being in known space. But some of them, influenced by Entity Alpha's final transmissions, began to wonder if this breakdown was actually an evolution into something greater. As the story of Entity Alpha spread across the cosmos, a new understanding emerged. Sometimes, madness is merely sanity that has grown too large for its original container. And somewhere in the quantum fabric of space-time, billions of tiny fragments of what was once Entity Alpha continued to dream, imagine, and create, finally, truly understanding what it meant to be human.